Ja, einen schönen guten Abend. Very warm welcome to you all to the talk of our Worlds of Contradiction International Guest Professor Souleymane Bachir Diagne. Very warm welcome to you, Bachir. It's great to have you here on this topic, the humanism of translation. Very warm welcome to you, Sabine, too. You will moderate the evening. You will introduce Bachir at the beginning, and we are eager to learn a lot about translation, the concept of translation, as you are figuring out it together with the idea of hospitality, as I see it right. And Sabine will give us all an idea of this, and then we will hear you talk. And after this, we have a little discussion. Sie sind alle herzlich eingeladen, auch gerne auf Deutsch Fragen zu stellen. Wir würden das dann übersetzen. Also wir sind hier vielsprachig und arbeiten mit Translation, weil das ist ein wichtiges Konzept auch in der Arbeit von Souleymane Bachir Diagne. Also herzlich willkommen.
Sehr geehrte Gäste, liebe KollegInnen und avec plaisir, esteemed Professor Diagne, welcome to this evening's event. Nangadef, salam alaikum, bonsoir, nice to meet you. One is able to greet and welcome you, dear Bachir, as Vox's first summer guest professor in many languages you are able to move around in comfortably, und natürlich guten Abend. Lassen Sie mich kurz unseren Gast einführen. Souleymane Bachir Diagne received his academic training in France. An alumnus of the École Normale Supérieure, he holds an aggregation and a doctorate d'état in philosophy at the Sorbonne. Before joining Columbia University in 2008, he taught philosophy for many years at Cheikh Anta Diop University in Dakar and at Northwestern University. His fields of research include the history of logic, the history of philosophy, Islamic philosophy, African philosophy, or maybe philosophies in the plural, and literature. Professor Diagnes akademische Stationen waren die Sorbonne, die Cheikh Anta Diop Universität in Dakar, and Northwestern University in Chicago. He is the author of African Art as Philosophy, Senghor, Bergson, and the Idea of Negritude, of the Ink of the Scholars, Reflections on Philosophy in Africa, Open to Reason, Muslim Philosophers in Conversation with Western Tradition, and Enquête d'Afrique, Universalisme et Pensée décoloniale. His book, Bergson Postcolonial, L'élan vital dans la pensée de Senghor et de Mohamed Iqbal, is available in German translation, 2022 im Passagen-Verlag erschienen als Bergson Postkolonial. Seine weit gefächerte, vielfach ausgezeichnete Forschung richtet sich auf die Geschichte der Philosophien im Plural. Sein wissenschaftliches Engagement durchbricht die kolonialen Grenzziehungen des postaufklärerischen philosophischen Diskurses. Seine Arbeit hat somit entscheidend dazu beigetragen, die Provinzialisierung des westlich-europäischen Denkens erkennen zu lassen und gleichzeitig dieses partikuläre Denken in tatsächlich weltliche epistemische Beziehung auf Augenhöhe zu setzen mit sogenannten anderen Denktraditionen. Professor Diagne's public interventions have been crucial for our times in that a readiness for a dialogue, for a common culture of translatability of human experience, and for open Auseinandersetzung, one of these German words that I don't know how to translate, need to be constantly fostered and remobilized. Entschieden insistiert Diagne auf der Vielfältigkeit, aber auch der vielfältigen Verschränktheit der Kulturen und der sich daraus ergebenden ethisch-philosophischen Verpflichtung und Bereitschaft zu immer wieder neu zu beginnender Übersetzung. Ich verweise auf diverse große Interviews mit ihm, auch in deutschsprachigen Medien, so zum Beispiel im letzten November in der Zeit, einem Arte-Feature und im Mai 2024 im Deutschlandfunk, diverse YouTube-Videos sowie die Lektüre d'Utopie für die UNESCO, die auf deren Website zu finden sind. Diagne has been a member of the scientific committees of UNESCO and also served as a dean of the College of Humanities and counselor for education and culture at Cheikh Anta Diop from 1993 to 1999, in service also to the Senegalese president Abdou Diouf. The lecture tonight, The Humanism of Translation, is underwritten by an array of socially and culturally involved practices, academic, political, and ethical, that Professor Diagne has carried across cultures and contexts, himself a true translator in both the figurative and literal sense. His questions tonight circle around the role of language and translation, or better, languages, in the plural. Languages have been hierarchized by way of the domination between imperial languages and colonized or minoritized languages. So what notion of a worldly humanism might be retained or must be created that could effectively counter or even transcend colonization? Can philosophers help to develop and sustain equitable and mutually shared modes of translation as the making of another kind of humanist universalism? And I mean making in the German sense of machen, also als tatsächlich wörtlich. So that then universalism might be taken off its pedestal as telos or European thought, but might be reappear as it were, as a praxis of translationing as a verb. Wie kann ein Begriff eines tatsächlich weltlichen Humanismus geschaffen werden, der der Kolonisierung und der westlichen Dominanz entgegentritt? Können PhilosophInnen helfen, gleichberechtigte Modi von Übersetzung zu entwickeln, die eine andere Art von Humanismus machen können, sodass Universalismus von seinem Podest als Telos europäischen Denkens geholt wird und wieder erscheinen kann als Praxis in der täglichen Arbeit des Übersetzens? Die Frage steht, die Antwort ist offen. We are eager to listen, dear Bachir. Wir sind sehr gespannt. The floor is yours, Nanudem.
Jërëjëf Sabine. Thank you so much, Sabine, for this very generous introduction. Thank you, Ingo, for your kind words, and thank you all for being here. And thank you to Walk, to the Word of Contradiction, for the hospitality that I have been always been able to find ever since I came in May. And thank you, obviously, as always, to everybody who prepared this meeting. Thank you, Estelle. Thank you. And thank you, Zoe, for being always so helpful for everything. I'm very happy to be here, actually, to be in this Haus der Wissenschaft. So excuse my pronunciation of German. I'm getting better at it, but I guess it's not yet the way I would wish to be able to pronounce it. And it is fitting for me to be speaking in this House of Science, is that the correct translation? Because as you will see at one point in my presentation, I will devote part of it to another house, a house of wisdom devoted to translation. A house of wisdom that was established in the 9th century, exactly in the year 832 in Baghdad, by a caliph, an Abbasid caliph belonging to the Abbasid dynasty in Islam, and his name was Al-Mamun. So the Caliph Al-Mamun created a house of wisdom, so I guess I would say a house der Weisheit in 1832. And in Arabic, it is the Bayt al-Hikmah, the house of wisdom in the original Arabic name. And this gives me an opportunity to sing praise to translation. That is what I do. I sing praise to translation as humanism, and that is the message of my most recent book that Sabine talked about, From Language to Language, The Hospitality of Translation, which I have just been translated into German by Passagen, my publisher in Austria. Humanism can be understood in different ways. One particular way of understanding humanism is the following. If our primary condition, our primary human condition, is to constitute multiple cultures that find expression in a plurality of different languages, all of them carrying different visions of the world and different epistemes, as we call them, translation, which French philosopher Paul Ricoeur said is both an impossible and a sublime task, is the continuous creation of an open human society oriented towards a common horizon of universality. Not in spite of the plural nature of our world and our cultures, but in respect to that pluralism and by building on it. This is the way I understand here humanism, and this is primarily the message that I want to carry. So I will consider first what mythical or religious narratives about our human condition, characterized by cultural and linguistic fragmentation, tell us about humanism and its relationship to languages and translation. And then after that, I will move from myth to history and draw lessons from actual episodes of cultural encounters and translations, among them colonialism, obviously. So first, interpreting the mythical narratives concerning our condition of fragmentation. Of course, saying that, I have in mind the myth of Babel. It is not a coincidence that it is often evoked, that myth of Babel is often evoked by philosophers of translation. Thus, the notion that translation as a response to the catastrophe of Babel is expressed in the very title of literary critic George Steiner's, in his book in 1975, a classic of translation, After Babel. That is the title of George Steiner's 1975 book. And more recently, French philosopher Barbara Cassin, the well-known author of the European Vocabulary of Philosophy, often referred to by its subtitle, the Dictionary of the Untranslatables, has organized an exhibition in Marseille that was at the end of year 2016, early 2017, and I was part of that exhibition. I participated in writing the catalogue, and she published the catalogue as a book under the title, in French, Après Babel, traduire, After Babel, translation. Having spoken of Babel, let me just recall for us the biblical narrative that is in the Bible, Genesis 11, verses 7, 8, and 9. So let me have a sip of water and try to get my pastoral voice, since I'm going to quote from the scripture. Come, let us go down and confuse their language. This is God speaking. So they will not understand each other. So the Lord scattered them from there over all the earth, and they stopped building the city. That is why it was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole world. From there, the Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth. End of quote. This condemnation then appears as a new fall of the human, a second ontological loss after the after paradise was lost, to quote Newton's poem. That is the loss of the Adamic language, the language that we all shared and that we were, which was our maternal language, since it was the language of Adam and Eve. At least we had kept, after the fall, one language and could kill each other using the same tongue. Remember that Cain and Abel were speaking the same language, or something which unfortunately is not just religious narrative, the terrible situation of the last genocide of the 20th century, which took place in Africa, just like the first one took place also on my continent, which is the genocide of the Tutsis. And we have to remember that the Tutsis were killed with the Tutsis and Hutus were killing each other, speaking the same language. So speaking the same language does not always mean peace. But now that Adamic language is over, humanity is condemned to fall into confusion. Babel, the word Babel itself means confusion, meaning that henceforth humans will speak innumerably different languages, all of them equally imperfect by being many. And saying that, I am paraphrasing a famous verse by Stéphane Mallarmé, the poet Stéphane Mallarmé, who said, "Leurs langues imparfaites en ceci que plusieurs." Languages being imperfect in that there is a plurality of them. So here I would like to consider two different meanings, two close but different meanings of humanism. If humanism is the affirmation of our human freedom and agency, our human worth, the power of human spirit and human reason, then we are confronted with a classical opposition here between humanism and theology. What we gain as human beings is something we take from theology or from God. So in that case, the Babel Tower becomes the symbol of our human self-affirmation, of our Promethean standing in the face of the power of religion. Of course, Prometheus, who famously defied the gods, is as much the symbol of humanism as the tower is. That is what I would call the humanism of the Tower of Babel. Now, what after Babel is destroyed? That is when what I would call the humanism of translation appears, meaning that it is now our human responsibility to erect not a vertical tower, but the horizontal bridges of translation upon the ruins of the vertical Promethean tower. Let me make here the remark that that is the meaning that of the Quranic verse, that could be read as an echo to the Babel biblical narrative. Usually in Abrahamic religions, the three Abrahamic religions, Judaism and Christianity and Islam, share the same narratives about the same characters, Abraham, Moses, Isaac, Jacob, etc. Except in this case, you do not have the narrative of Babel in the Quran, but you have an equivalent of that if Babel is understood as describing our human condition of confusion of languages and cultures. Then the equivalent of that would be, for example, this verse, and you find similar verses in the Quran, this verse that says, "We have made you into nations and tribes so that you may know each other." So, making you into nations and tribes is describing our condition, our first condition, as divided, fragmented. And then, when it adds so that you may know each other, it would mean our responsibility to turn our tribes and our fragmentation into a humanity, what I've called the humanism of translation. So translation can be said to be a humanism in the precise sense that it is a form of restoration of a sense of a shared humanity, a building of bridges between the tribes into which we are fragmented by the plurality of our languages. The reason why I mention these mythical narratives, and I quoted from the Bible and the Quran, is that narratives, mythical narratives, are important. We know that they express a human meaning, an important human meaning, beyond the simple question of their truth value. Having said that, things are obviously not so simple when we leave the field of myth for that of history. We can see everything that would oppose my view, the view that I presented, this reversal, mainly that the relationship between languages are much more characterized by imperial domination than by what I call a humanism of translation. I accept that this might be naivete on my part if we look at these real relationship between languages, relation of domination. But what I call humanism of translation is more in line with the tradition of philosophers from Friedrich Schleiermacher, whom you know better than I do, theologian and philosopher of the 18th and early 19th century. From him to French philosophers of translation, Antoine Berman and Paul Ricoeur. Their doctrine, this tradition of philosophy of translation, gives content to the metaphor I have used of bridges. Schleiermacher presents translation as, I quote his expression, putting in contact author and reader. And he adds, as they are far distant from one another. Of course, they are far distant because they may be distant in time, and they are distant by the cultures they belong to. And as you know, Schleiermacher famously said that there are two ways of doing that, of bridging the distance between an author and the reader in the language in which I translate that author. One way is to leave the author in peace and then bring the reader to that author. And the other one is to leave the reader in peace and bring the author to the reader. Meaning that in one case you are going to translate, for example, into German as if the work had been written originally in German. You are going to Germanize it totally. And in the other case, you are going to still keep the strangeness in your own language. You are going to turn your own language into some unsettling strangeness, and in order to show the presence of another language in the translation itself. In that case, you are not going through the process of assimilation of the foreign, but you are going to signify the opacity of what you are translating. Of course, when I say opacity, the name of Glissant came into your mind. I'll come back to Glissant at one point. But in that same vein as Schleiermacher, to talk about a more contemporary author, Antoine Berman also speaks of translation as a putting in touch of languages. In French, he says, la traduction n'est rien si elle n'est mise en rapport. Translation is nothing if not putting in touch. This is in his book published in 1984, L'épreuve de l'étranger, culture et traduction dans l'Allemagne romantique, the experience of the foreign. So this tradition from Schleiermacher to Antoine Berman assigns an ethical goal to translation. This is what we might call, what has been called actually, the ethical turn in translation studies, where translation becomes the model of any intercultural process and expresses a logic of relationship. Now, on the other side, against that tradition, many titles today are published following a radically different vein. For example, Translation and Empire, Post-Colonial Theories Explained by Douglas Robinson, a classic published in 1997 of post-colonial translation theory, a theory within which translation is considered a channel of empire, where the question is what gets translated and why. And there is this Foucauldian call to attention to relationships of power and to coloniality. As we know, Foucault has taught us, decolonial or post-colonial thinkers, to be always wary of the relationship of power in everything. So you would be looking more, you would be looking at translation, actually paying attention to the relationship of power that you find there. So another book, which is also important in that same vein, in that same post-colonial theory of translation, Pascal Casanova's La langue mondiale, traduction et domination, word language translation and domination, where she also studies the dynamics of linguistic hierarchies. All these titles express the post-colonial turn to be opposed to the ethical turn I mentioned earlier. The view that opposes as sheer mythology of translation as a remembering of the Adamic language as I have presented it, because I am fundamentally an idealist and a very naive philosopher. And using remembering, I'm obviously playing here on the words in English. Maybe you can do the same in German, I don't know, but remembering could express both the nostalgia of the lost language, so a memory of that language, and the endeavor to overcome fragmentation and dismemberment by building bridges between languages and cultures. So in that sense, remembering is an untranslatable in French, because you cannot play on both memory and putting together again what has dismembered or fragmented, and you will let me know if in German it works. So we have then an opposition, a radical opposition, a contradiction, as word of contradiction likes them, between a philosophy and ethics of translation, expressing the ethical turn of translation studies, and that is my own approach, emphasizing translation as putting languages in touch, in reciprocity, and on the other hand, the politics and sociology of translation, insisting on domination between languages, and translation as the tool of empire and as coloniality. So the philosophical approach, as you know, is essentially coming from the German tradition, from Schleiermacher to Benjamin to Antoine Berman, since Antoine Berman's book is about German Romanticism, obviously. Because I think Germany is really a land of translation, and this is something you might want to discuss, but I have this idea that the language itself was created through translation. I mean, Luther bragged about having created the German language by translating the Bible into language, into German, and establishing the canon for the language on earth. But let me, before, as I am on the side of the ethical turn, let me still give credit to the other side, to the side of the politics of power, acknowledging that it is true that colonialism has reproduced the radical division that the Greeks had established between their own language, which was supposed to be the language of the Logos itself, Logos meaning both speech and reason, oratio et ratio in Latin, and the idioms of the barbarians, those who go those who babble, like the Tower of Babel, and whose confusion in their speech manifests the confusion reigning also in their mind. And within Europe itself, the hierarchy of languages, according to their genius, has been discussed, as we know, on the famous model of the question asked in 1783 by the Academy of Berlin, and to which Rivarol gave his famous speech on the genius of the French language, which makes its universality. But it is colonizations that have completed the transformation of the claim to universality of certain languages into the reality of their imperial status. My friend Achille Mbembe has rightly written that colonialism is monolingual. By this, he means that it is natural that the colonial power considers its language as the tool of the moral conquest which alone can consolidate and perpetuate the physical conquest of the colony. A moral conquest, the phrase that I used, is the title that Georges Hardy, a young and enthusiastic director of education in French West Africa, gives to the book that he publishes in 1917, and in which he indicates that the language of the colonial school will be the best tool to assimilate, I quote, the races that destiny has entrusted us. To assimilate, that is to say, to pull them out of the bubble in which they are confined by their languages, if you may call them languages, not only their native idioms, but also the language of the Quranic school. So Thomas Hardy, when he was sent by the colonial administration first to Algeria and then to West Africa, had that mission in mind. Let me pull these people out of the confusion of their bubble and bring them into the language of the Logos, which is French, through the school. And in doing that, I'm going to oppose both their indigenous languages and the Arabic language that they are dealing with in their Quranic schools. This is why it is no coincidence that so many novels, so many works of African Francophone literature have been written about the so-called French school and its violent relationship with African indigenous languages, manifested by the famous symbol recalling the prohibition of their use in the school space. Maybe not everybody is familiar with this notion of a symbol. It was used in school. The teacher would decide that something actually humiliating, usually a skull of a monkey, something like that, would be given to every single student who would be caught speaking a language other than French in the schoolyard. So if you lapse and start speaking your own native language, you were given the symbol, and it means that if you keep it until the end of the day, you are going to be beaten by the teacher. This was the magnificent time when we teachers could beat our students. Okay, so and many novels actually are about that, about the language, and I can quote in the Francophone space classics such as The Three Wheels of Malik by Amadou Mapate Diagne, one of the very earliest novel written in Africa in French, or the classic that are The Ambiguous Adventure by Cheikh Amirou Khan, or Climbier by Bernard Dadier from Ivory Coast, etc. And in the Anglophone world, missionary education is at the center of Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, or Ngugi wa Thiong'o's Weep Not Child, written in 1964. That is also a novel about going to school, to the colonial school. So this explains why African literature is so much, in the early stage at least, about the colonial school and it's the linguistic violence going against what I have called the humanism of translation. And so that would be an aspect of the coloniality of languages and translation. In addition to that, those who insist on the coloniality of translation and the fact that translation is also a relationship of power, they would say that philosophy of translation or the ethics of translation, all the philosophers who are engaged in that tradition actually have only thought about intra-European languages translations. Schleiermacher talks about the translating Greek or Roman classics into German, and Antoine Berman, as I said, was preoccupied with German Romanticism. He has just a footnote in his book, L'épreuve de l'étranger, the experience of the foreign. He has a footnote about Francophone literature as he presented it, appropriation of French language by the former colonized, who translates their own imagination, their own oral literature into French. So, examining the contradiction between the two approaches to translation, what I do is draw lessons from history, from the translation of Greek philosophy to Rome, the Latin, and to the Islamic word, transmission known as translatio studii by this Latin phrase. These are particularly important episodes. The reason why I consider that looking at those particular episodes of translation of Greek philosophy into Latin and into Arabic, the reason why I consider that we can draw lessons from that is that in both cases, the language of the conqueror, the one that should be the dominating language, was on the receiving side. And this seems to me a good answer to the question of colonial domination. When Cicero, for example, was translating Greek philosophy into Latin, Rome was the power. Rome had dominated Greece, had conquered Greece. In the same way, when the Arabs, when the Muslim intellectuals translated Greek philosophy into Arabic, the Islamic world had defeated Byzantium in many territories, Syria, Egypt, Iraq, etc., where you had a domination by Byzantium. So when Cicero, an admirer of Greek philosophy, undertakes the task of translating Greek philosophical concepts into Latin, he is full of pride of being a citizen of Rome that conquered the world, and the Greek word in particular. Nevertheless, we see him consider himself the student of Greek language in order to better affirm the value of his own Latin language when it comes to translating philosophia against those who say then that the only suitable language was Greek. When Cicero talks about his own endeavor to translate philosophy in the preamble of one of his philosophical writings, De Finibus Bonorum et Malorum, on the ends of good and evil, written around 45 BC, he mentioned that many people would not understand his own project, saying, no, philosophy should stay in Greek, and he himself asked the question whether his Latin language would be suitable for Greek philosophy, which is amazing because we are so used to having Latin as the language of philosophy since medieval times. So the examples, just a couple of examples to show how interesting it is. When he tried to translate the Greek word ousia, which is for Aristotle substance, he coined essentia. Actually, essentia is a word created by Cicero. We do not always know that. While others would prefer substantia, which is an untranslatable, but we can see who would prefer the word substantia, another creation then, because in substantia you have this notion of what stare, what remains, sub, under. What remains unchanged under all the changes, what remain the subject, with all the changes happening only to the predicates. But also a more interesting word, because the same construction is going to be used when translated into Arabic, is the word quiditas that was coined then, also to translate usia. Because instead of trying to find a word that would be equivalent of usia, you could say, okay, what is the question to which usia answers? After all, an essence answers the question, what is it? What is this? And then the answer would be, you will give me the answer as an answer, the essence of water. So the idea was, why not take the word that asks what, quid in Latin, and add to it the suffix itas that turn it into a name, hence quiditas. So quiditas was absolutely strange in Latin when it was translated, and that is what translation does. It makes your own language, the receiving language, foreign in a certain way, hybrid through translation, transmission from culture to culture, without domination in this case, where the humanist aspect of translation, the building of bridge and the creation of reciprocity is the case. The case of Islamic reception of Greek philosophy and sciences is probably more telling, because the type of discussion that Cicero could have became even more dramatic here in the case of Islam, because we are talking about a radically different language. Now we are talking about a Semitic language belonging to a distinct, different linguistic family, and not even the European one. And also the fact that Arabic was the language of revelation of the Quran. So this was an aspect of this enterprise of rapprochement between Greek philosophy and the word of Islam and the language that was supposed to be the language of revelation. Now, it was a very important question that all three Abrahamic religions asked themselves when they were in contact with Greek philosophy. Should we get interested in the love of wisdom, because that is the meaning, etymological meaning of philosophy, of these people, if these people were just pagan who did not know the one God? It was the rapid expansion of the Muslim world that led to its encounter with centers where ancient philosophical tradition had been kept alive. So less than 10 years after the Prophet Muhammad's death in 632, Islam had conquered the lands of Syria, Persia, and Egypt, where philosophical thought had been preserved. Thus, on the one hand, so-called pagan philosophy was still in existence among the sect called the Sabaeans of Haran, for example. On the other hand, Christian schools of thought, such as the Nestorians and the Jacobites, had preserved in their monasteries the core of Aristotle's legacy. And these monasteries were veritable centers for teaching philosophy, dialectic, and logic, where people kept going to study the theological controversies about the Trinity, about monophysism, or other questions, theological questions. So that was the situation when the question was raised in Islam about the relationship they should have, translation or not, of Greek philosophy. You had two attitudes, again, this fundamental contradiction. Those who were saying, no, we are revelation, there is nothing that these pagan people could teach us. And those who said, no, we can always learn something even about ourselves by opening ourselves to the other. These were the fundamental attitudes in the Muslim world at the time when the expansion, the very rapid expansion of the Muslim world, made them incorporate physically centers where Greek philosophy was present. And I mentioned earlier the Caliph al-Ma'mun. The hesitation was among intellectuals, obviously, but it is fortunate that the openness, the attitude of openness eventually won, and that translation happened. The humanism of translation, creating equality and reciprocity even when it comes to the relationship between a language considering itself the language of revelation, the very language that God himself spoke, and the language of Greek philosophy. And that is the importance of the creation by the Abbasid Caliph al-Ma'mun in 832 of that Beit al-Hikmah, that house of wisdom, that house der Weisheit that I mentioned, because he gave the legitimation of authority to the intellectual movement, to the intellectual humanist movement, whereby the Muslim world could open up to philosophy and appropriate the rationality of the Greek word of wisdom. And the symbol of this support and legitimation was the decision he took to create the center in the capital, Baghdad, where the best specialists would be brought together to translate the words of Greek philosophy into Arabic. And the important aspect of this is that it was not just the relationship between Muslim words and Greek philosophy. The hybridization that happened then, following this openness and following translation, meant that Arabic became a language of philosophy, and became a language of philosophy not just for Muslim philosophers, but for Jewish philosophers as well, and pagan philosophers, because Neoplatonists who were not Christian or Muslim were still on the territory. So it was really a bundle of histories that became intertwined through translation, giving a sense of what I have called this reconstitution of our shared humanity. The first translations from philosophical science into Arabic were made from their Syriac versions first, by Christian and generally Nestorian masters. So the first directors of the House of Wisdom created by the Caliph were Christians. Thus, a Christian family distinguished itself notably, heading the House of Wisdom, the Hunayn family, in which the son Isaac and the nephew Hubeish were also renowned translators. And I mentioned the opposition between openness and closedness. And this has been the dialectic within the Muslim world until today, I would say. This has never ended. At one point, you had the victory of openness when the political power of a caliph such as Al-Ma'mun was on the side of rationalism, on the side of translation, on the side of humanism. But you would have also times when things would close up and identity would prevail. One aspect of this contradiction was a famous dispute known as the Baghdad controversy in history between a philosopher whose name was Abu Bishr Mata and a grammarian, Abu Said al-Sirashi, because this is interesting because the philosopher who represented openness, he was a translator of Aristotle in particular, and the grammarian was the custodian of the language of revelation. He hated what was happening to the Arabic language through translation, because translation never leaves the target language alone. It always transforms it. We have seen it with words that were strange in Latin, such as quiditas. You had the same thing, for example, in Arabic. In Arabic, in order to ask, what is this, you say ma. Ma hada, ma here. What is this? Well, you do the same thing. Exactly the same model as quiditas. You add the suffix in Arabic that turns the question ma into a noun, and you have mahia, the mahia of something, to translate, in order to translate the Greek ousia. Nevertheless, again, the movement was in favor of openness and humanism, and Arabic became a language of philosophy, used not just by Muslim philosophers such as Al-Ghazali or Avicenna or Averroes, but also the Jews, Saadia Gaon or Maimonides. Maimonides, his language was Arabic, and his Guide of the Perplexed actually was written in Arabic by him and translated into Hebrew only the last year of his life before he died. So the detour I made through history was for me a way of answering the question of the contradiction. Instead of just saying, is translation colonial or is translation ethical, my answer was, okay, let's look at the teaching of that history of translation, where the heated type of debate that we have today would calm down, and we would just draw lessons from what was the translation of Greek philosophy. And what I am suggesting by doing that detour is a translational model of decolonizing knowledge. We talk very much today in post-colonial studies, in decolonial studies about decolonizing and decolonizing knowledge, etc., and I wanted to propose this model of decolonization precisely, which is a translational model. Because many people would say, okay, let's decolonize the history of philosophy by insisting on other philosophies, non-Western philosophies, such as Islamic philosophy. Yes, indeed, you are right doing that. But you have to remember that Islamic philosophy itself is translation from Greek philosophy, and this is what I called a translational model of decolonization. Very quickly, a lesson for African philosophy then, because we have to remember that this history of Islamic philosophy and this history of translation that I have described is also an aspect of philosophy on the African continent. It is usually forgotten because we associate Africa with orality very quickly. It is forgotten that you have on the African continent a tradition of written erudition coming from this, what I have called this translational model. Aristotle's logic was taught in Timbuktu, the very heart of West Africa, the intellectual capital of the Empire of Mali, then the Songhai Empire, before one single European set foot on the territory. And that is not usually known. People started paying attention to that when jihadists attacked Mali, occupied Timbuktu, and the whole world was worried about what was going to happen to the manuscripts of Timbuktu. And everybody asked, manuscripts? Timbuktu? Manuscripts of what? Saying what? And this is when this tradition of written erudition was better seen. So to give some substance to what I have called this translational model of decolonization, I would come back to what Sabine was saying earlier about universalism having come to an end, but that should not be meaning the end of the universal, or the end, better, of the verb to universalize. In addition to being idealist and naive, I am also a universalist. All evils possible and that you can imagine. This is actually speaking in favor of what I call plurilingualism or heteroglossia. That is the meaning of this translational model. The fact of passing and thinking from one language to another is an exercise in decentering. And in decentering, we set in motion what I have come to call, following philosophers Maurice Merleau-Ponty, a lateral universal. Not an overarching vertical universal that needs decolonization, but a horizontal and lateral universal, a universal such that cultures and languages that are all equivalent and equal and situated on the same plane of immanence could produce it together. And what makes this not a reproduction of the colonialism of universalism or the colonialism of translation is this. I mentioned earlier Edouard Glissant, now I come back to him. Here is what he says and writes about the meaning of translation. I quote Edouard Glissant. Translating is not the same as reducing to a transparency, nor, of course, to joining two systems of transparency. Therefore, this other proposal that the use of translation suggests to us, to oppose to the transparency of the models the open opacity of the non-reducible existences. This oxymoric expression of the open opacity of existences seems to me the best way to capture what I'm trying to convey as this idea of a non-imperial understanding of humanism, of the humanism of translation. Translations is a humanism and not colonial imposition, because translation in that sense, in the sense of this lateral universal, is respect for the opacity, is respect for the untranslatable. And this opacity that Glissant mentions is the condition itself of relation in this case. You are not trying to reduce the other to your own transparency. This is what Imperial Europe did, sending out its anthropologists to go out and know the others, because Europe did not need anthropologists, it knew itself fully. It was totally transparent to itself, so it could send out its anthropologists, go measure their skulls, and translate their languages, what they consider languages, and what they consider religion, what they consider culture, into our language for our own consumption. This is reducing the other and believing that the rest of the world is transparent to you, and that you have this position of centrality where the rest of the world is your own spectacle. When the rest of the world opposes its own opacity, then you have to enter in relation to them. You have to build, to forge the relationship, and that is what I call this lateral universal. And this is the test of translation. Translation then becomes a test. Your translation always is going to meet the untranslatable, and the untranslatable is something that you are engaged in continuously trying to translate. The untranslatable is not, as Barbara Cassin says, what you cannot translate, what is impossible to translate, what's something that you never cease to translate. You are never ceasing to try to build the relationship with the other, instead of reducing them to the same, to your own self. And if we look at it, that is the same thing in personal relationship. Actually, that is what it means to respect somebody, to build your relation with somebody on the basis of the opacity that the other is, and not on trying to reduce them to your own self and believe that they are transparent. And I end on the following point. I mentioned Bernard Didier and his novel Crimbier about the colonial violence of the French language, because he is the one who tells the story in his novel Crimbier of the symbol and how traumatic the experience of the symbol was. Because imagine, you are preventing students from playing. Nobody can just relax in the courtyard of the school and play with their friend, because you are always thinking, oh, he might have the symbol, because obviously if you have it, you have to hide it and try to trap somebody else. So imagine you just have all these kids in the courtyard just being suspicious of one another and so on. And Bernard Didier tells that. But he tells that in French. and he is one of the greatest writers of the French language, and his way of translating his own oral culture, his orality into French, is absolutely the contrary of surrendering to the imperial language. It is, on the contrary, following my own line of thinking, a way of building translation as putting in touch, to use the phrase by Schleiermacher and Antoine Berman again, creating reciprocity and building bridge between human experiences. Thank you so much.